Did Jesus rise from the dead? I realise that I'm posting a lot of videos lately on kind of spiritual theological themes and exploring certain Christian ideas. I didn't set out to do this intentionally, but one thing that people often ask me is why I left the church, for example. Why did I become an atheist? What was my journey? And a lot of these videos that I'm posting now and that I've posted earlier are partly an answer to that question. I get asked that here online. I also get asked it in real life. And the answers to these questions are never simple and straightforward. And I don't want to just sit there and bore people with my story when we're having dinner. So instead, I'll bore you. I do also have issues with Christianity, particularly evangelical versions of Christianity. I think they pose a real threat to the world, and we could well do without them. But it's not my intention here to try to change anybody's mind, to change their belief system. I actually don't think you can ever do that, and certainly no amount of reasoning is going to do that. But what I do want to do is explain some of my own thought processes and something of the historical development of my own belief system, the way my beliefs changed and evolved over the years. And this is a good way, first of all, for me to get that clear in my own mind and also to present it to you. Now, you can take it or leave it, as you obviously will. Many of you will probably choose to attack me. Most of you will probably ignore me. That's fine. But these are ideas that I find interesting. But I like the idea of clarifying these ideas and putting them out there for you to consider or not as you please. Today I'm thinking about the idea of Jesus' resurrection. Did Jesus rise from the dead? Well, at some point in my theological journey, in my theological evolution, I decided that I couldn't believe in a literal, physical, bodily resurrection of Jesus. I'm not alone in this. The prominent Lutheran theologian Rudolf Bultmann in the 20th century argued that the whole New Testament should be demythologized and that the resurrection, the virgin birth too, and many other things should be understood as myth rather than as historical events. The American Episcopalian Bishop John Shelby Spong made similar claims, and Paul Tillich was another theologian, a German-American philosopher and Lutheran theologian, who understood the resurrection to have symbolic significance rather than representing an historical event. Others have claimed that the idea of the resurrection was based on visions that the disciples had of Jesus after his death, rather than on the fact of a literally empty tomb. Many theologians have thought along these lines, both before and after me. The resurrection became, for me, a symbolic representation of the ultimate victory of God over death. Or alternatively, sometimes it became a kind of image of a higher humanity, along the lines I've spoken of before, along the lines of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin's idea of the omega point as the end point of evolution. Now, this all sounds a bit Star Trek-y, I know. So many of the advanced races in the Star Trek franchise have evolved beyond the physical body to some kind of higher energetic state. As cheesy as this sounds, this made more sense to me than the idea that a human corpse had actually been reanimated. But leaving that Star Trek theme aside, the resurrection was symbolic of a new life after an equally symbolic death. Death to sin, death to the old self and all that. Pretty much what the baptism ceremony symbolises and represents. Although I tried for a long time, I'm afraid my scientific disposition ultimately made it impossible to believe in the more supernatural and literal interpretations of the Bible and the Christian tradition. I'm afraid my worldview couldn't in the end accommodate this kind of supernaturalism. For quite a while, though, these symbolic and mythological reinterpretations of the Christian narrative helped to keep me in the fold. The Anglican Church was always able to accommodate a wide range of different theological interpretations. I don't know if that's still the case. I don't know if it's become more conservative over the years. There's more to the story, though. The physical resurrection of Jesus, even from a theological point, had always given me some problems. It had always seemed like a bit of a cheat to me. Wasn't the death of Jesus on the cross meant to be some kind of ultimate sacrifice? God sacrificed his son for our sins, or Jesus offered himself up as a sacrifice on our behalf. Wasn't the whole point that Jesus suffered and died, that he experienced all that involved, including a sense of separation from God? But doesn't the concept of the resurrection then completely undo all this if he just comes back to life again a couple of days later? And even more so if he knew this was going to happen. And there are certainly verses in the New Testament that indicate he did know this. Mark 9:31, for example. He said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise." So, according to this at least, he knew that his death wasn't final. He was going to rise again. That seems to me to kind of undo the whole point of the death on the cross. Now, clearly that would not be a pleasant experience, but it must surely take some of the sting out of it to know that you're going to come back to life in a couple of days. This is not what the rest of us experience when we face death. At least we didn't until Jesus did it all first. And isn't that intended to take the sting out of death for us? So if it did it for us, surely it did it for Jesus too. So within the Christian narrative of the death and resurrection of Christ, within the very narrative itself, there is this inherent inconsistency. The resurrection undoes the death on the cross. The whole self-sacrifice thing surely works so much better if Jesus doesn't rise from the dead, at least literally and physically. So, quite apart from the fact that my worldview couldn't accommodate that kind of event, there's this internal tension in the Christian narrative. It's more consistent and makes more sense if Jesus doesn't rise from the dead. The references that Jesus makes to his own resurrection can probably be understood as interpolations introduced by the authors rather than the actual words of Jesus himself. Now, as I say, this helped me for a while. Eventually, though, the whole structure fell apart. There were too many contortions required to hold it all together. The evangelical biblical fundamentalists may be right. Maybe if you ask any questions at all, if you deny any single part of the story, the whole edifice eventually collapses. Of course, you can only hold it all together if you perform even more contortions than I had to, or else pretend that the difficulties don't exist. It must be so exhausting trying to hold it all together. I know it was for me.